Hello, my name is Anatoly Motkin. I'm president of Strategist. And today I have a privilege to discuss with Dr. Katarína Mathernová, Deputy Director-General of Directorate-General of Neighbourhood and Enlargement negotiations, what would be the COVID-19 consequences for EU and Eastern Partnership countries' cooperation. So the question is, for many people in Eastern Partnership countries, the COVID-19 pandemic have posed the question, what state system is better able to cope with such threats? Some of the countries are more liberal, some of the countries are more authoritarian. And from your perspective, is there any relation between the nature of the regime and the ability to combat the pandemic?
Would you be so kind and repeat the last sentence?
Yeah, from your perspective, is there any correlation between the nature of the regime of Eastern Partnership countries and their ability to combat the pandemic? I mean, is there any difference, distinguishing between the more authoritarian and more liberal countries and their ability to cope with the pandemic?
Well, I think I wouldn't necessarily draw this or mention these consequences naturally only for Eastern Partnership. We can see I think worldwide that different regimes reacted differently to COVID, and some, with some democracies fared better, some more autocratic regimes fared better. So I think that I would not necessarily say that would be the sole distinguishing feature between who fares better and who doesn't fare better in Eastern Partnership. I think I would say that what the world experience shows us is that the more populist regimes, or with regimes with more populist leaders, tend to not do that well in the pandemic. But I think there are so many variables, including previous experiences with pandemics, etc. So I would stop at that.
I see. So, but Belarus was the only Eastern Partnership country that had not introduced strict quarantine restrictions. How do you judge the results of the experience? Would it have any consequences for EU and Belarus relations?
I don't think it has consequences for EU-Belarus relations, and I think that again, I'm not sure that the word experiment is the one I would use in describing it. Plus, it's not the end of the crisis. I mean, it's very. I would reserve my right to judge once we have the final figures, once we have the vaccine, and we can then judge what has happened throughout the period.
I see. So, according to the announcement of the European Commission, the EU will provide 80 million euro for immediate and 883 million euro for medium-term support to the 6 Eastern Partnership countries in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. We understand that what was the purpose of the immediate assistance, but what would the EU medium-term support is allocated for?
Well, there were three areas of intervention. One was the immediate humanitarian, supply of personal protective equipment, etc. The second area is support to the health systems, and also institutionally and helping health systems, which is a medium-term measure, help strengthen the health systems. And the third area is support for the economy, and that's support for the liquidity provision to the enterprises facing liquidity constraints, etc. And a lot of it concentrated on SMEs, but also mid-cap companies and also individual entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm. I see. So if we move from medium-term to a long-term perspective, the economic consequences of the pandemic in the Eastern Partnership countries will have to be overcome for several years. All countries of the Eastern Partnership caught the pandemic during the period of rapid economic growth, and now economies are thrown back years ago. What the recommendations can the European Union provide to the governments of the Eastern Partnership countries to return to rapid economic growth?
Well, I think that it needs to continue with the reform path and with structural reforms for the economies, opening up the economies to get it into proper functioning. Plus, to use the stimuli that we are helping provide to restart the economy and get into a growth path. And we will continue programming very significant part of our assistance in the subsequent years to help precisely with the restarting of the economies.
I see. So the last crisis has demonstrated once again how vulnerable are the companies or the countries which are based on single supplier. Once China this time has locked its borders, many companies got to an easy situation, cut off their supply chain. Don't you think that it might be a good reason or a incentive to consider relocating part of European companies' production from China to Eastern Partnership countries, where the salaries today are competitive and the countries themselves are much closer to European border, EU border?
Well, I think that there are going to be a number of consequences from this crisis, including realignment in world trade flows. We are seeing very clearly that the decoupling between the US and China is a reality, and I think that there will be movements by a number of companies to nearshore, onshore or nearshore, as opposed to offshoring to faraway places. So I think that if the Eastern Partnership countries position themselves well, they could be the beneficiaries. But that would mean having a very favorable investment climate, having predictability in the rule of law, and in the overall environment, and then they can benefit from the trends that are likely to happen, as you mentioned, in bringing production closer to Europe.
Thank you. Now, during the pandemic, the economies of the Eastern Partnership countries made a huge leap in the process of digital transformation. Much of what was planned to be done in the coming years was done in just 2 months. And what is the perspective of the single digital market program and its integration with Eastern Partnership countries in this regard? Perhaps its goals will require adjustment.
Well, I think that the digital leap is a global phenomenon, and I think that also our colleagues who are looking after the digital single market now have a very busy period. And I think that there will be opportunities for closer integration in this area. I mean, we are building the digital single market. We don't have it yet. But I think that this is certainly an area where I see closer cooperation towards integration with the Eastern Partnership countries.
See, now, when we look say, on a political system in Eastern Partnership countries, and we know that it's an election circle this year in some of them, Belarus, Georgia, and others. And and some of them already discussed that there will be some restrictions because of the coronavirus, or maybe the elections would be moved to another date. And some oppositional parties doubt that it's actually not an excuse, or maybe only an excuse. So, what, from your perspective, how it's not a simple times, it's hectic times, and there is some measure of understanding that we should get in our approach. But what do you think? For what degree the local governments could use this coronavirus or corona crisis for their internal political purposes?
Well, I'm sure that the temptation is there, and all the more reason for all the institutions and all the various groups and civil society citizens to be vigilant to make sure that does not happen. I mean, the temptation, we can globally see that the temptation is there to use the crisis, but as the infections get under control, as the situation normalizes, also should the
the political system adjust to that.
And
okay, let's have one more question, because then I really have to run.
It's the last one. So the last question is about the Eastern Partnership Summit. What has changed in its agenda as a result of the pandemic, and what are the key deliverables to be achieved within the summit?
Okay, so we are not going to have a summit as such this week. What we are going to have is a leaders video conference, and the actual summit has been agreed to be held in the first part of next year under the Portuguese presidency. So not to replace the really unique possibility for a physical rendezvous just with a video conference. So we don't call this a summit, it's a leaders video conference, and it will be followed by a proper summit with a summit declaration, etc. in the spring of in the winter spring timing of next year, of 2021. So what the leaders meeting over video this week will bring is yes, it's going to I expect three things. One is it will talk about the COVID response that the EU has done, and really, I think, showed very quickly solidarity with the Eastern Partnership countries and many others around. Second, it's going to, I think, recognize the communication on Eastern Partnership, which went a little bit unnoticed because it was the beginning of the crisis, and it was in fact adopted at the first ever virtual meeting of the College of Commissioners in the beginning of May, and in the beginning of March, and that's the communication that talks about the overall narrative of resilience that we want to help achieve within our 6 Eastern partners. And it has 5 big areas of action for the future, including digital that we just discussed. And it's going to task the Commission with coming up with concrete deliverables that can then be endorsed at the proper summit in 2021. Just like we had the 20 deliverables for 2020, we want to have a roadmap of very practical and pragmatic goals also for the future. And we will be busily developing that in consultation with the partner countries before the summit of next year.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Mathernová, and please get my belated congratulations with your birthday yesterday, as I know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander.